Welcome in the mighty name of Jesus as we continue to look at the uniqueness of the nation of Israel. In this session we're going to look at the second diaspora, the dispersion of the Jewish people beyond Israel after the destruction that was wrought by the Romans. Malachi 3:6 says, I, the Lord, do not change, so you, the descendants of Jacob, are not destroyed. The purpose of this session is to establish several facts. Firstly, that the Jewish people were the last people to have a nation state in that land from AD 70 up until the time of 1948. There has never been a state of Palestine on the land. That does not mean there won't be in the future. That's no insult to the Palestinian people. It is just a historical fact that there has never been a Palestinian state in that land ever. It's to look at that how a remnant of Jews, Christians and others lived in that land even after the Romans have sent most of the Jews as slave across the empire, and even after the state had been disbanded in AD 70. Even after the Muslims invaded and conquered the land, taking it from their Byzantine rulers, a Palestinian state was never established, nor did it exist in the land throughout the time of all the many invaders and conquerors who came after the Roman conquest. In more recent times, the concept of a two-state solution was rejected by the Arab nations when the modern-day state of Israel was formed. So even to this day, there has never been a Palestinian state. Isaiah chapter 43, verse 5 to 6 says, Do not be afraid, for I am with you. I will bring your children from the east and gather you from the west. I will say to the north, Give them up, and to the south, do not hold them back. Bring my sons from afar, and my daughters from the ends of the earth. This prophecy from Isaiah refers to two events. It does refer to the return to the land from the Babylonian exile, which we have looked at in previous sessions. When the people returned, they came from the north and from the east, but they didn't come from the south and the west. But when God brought the Jewish people back into their homeland, after many centuries of exile, after the destruction of the temple and the city of Jerusalem by the Romans, he brought them from the north, the east, the south, and the west, from the furthest corners of the earth. The Jewish people were brought back into the land that had been promised to them by God to Abraham and his descendants. Promised by God, confirmed with an oath, and sealed by a covenant. Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 7 to 9 says, This is what the Lord says, Sing with joy for Jacob, shout for the foremost of the nations. Make your praises heard and say, Lord, save your people, the remnant of Israel. See, I will bring them back from the land of the north and gather them from the ends of the earth. Among them will be the blind and the lame, expectant mothers and women in labour. A great throng will return. They will come with weeping. They will pray as I bring them back. I will lead them beside streams of water on a level path where they will not stumble, because I am Israel's father, and Ephraim is my firstborn son. There's a lot of biblical prophecy concerning the Jewish people returning to their ancient homeland after the second diaspora. It was a biblical prophecy that was fulfilled last century and is still being fulfilled today, as many Jewish people from across the nations of the earth, for a number of reasons, are returning back to the land of Israel. No nation or ethnic group has been scattered to the four corners of the earth like the Jewish people have, and yet survived as an easily and recognisable group of people. And the Jewish people did survive all these centuries of exile as a distinct group of people, even though they were scattered to the four corners of the earth. They have faced much discrimination in many countries where they have been in throughout the century. They've experienced much hatred and tremendous persecution, but they never surrendered their identity. By keeping the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, they remembered who they were and God's promises to them. Non-Torah groups such as the Sadducees and non-traditional groups such as the Essenes died out completely after the destruction of the Second Temple. But the Jewish people, wherever they were scattered, the Jewish people who kept the Torah, they remembered who they were and God's promises to them. They kept their festivals. They honoured their Sabbath, often in secret because of the persecution they often faced in many different countries. Next year in Jerusalem was a popular saying. It was a phrase, and still is a phrase, that is sung at the end of Passover Seder, at the end of the service held on Yom Kippur. The Jewish people would say to each other, next year in Jerusalem. They always had an eye on returning back to the homeland. And in our next session we will be looking at how Zionism was founded and how these events happened to enable that to happen. But in this session we're going to be looking at what happened between AD 70 up until the First World War. I want to give you this response from Benjamin Disraeli, a man who was twice Prime Minister of Britain. When he was being insulted for his Jewish ancestry, he said this: "Sir, you are proud of your ancient descent, but in the veins of the meanest Jew there flows blood compared to which the blood of the proudest noble is ditch water. For when your ancestors were in a pagan tribe, mine was standing as priests in the temple of God." The Jewish people always remembered who they were and where they had come from. And that was part of God's plan for them, because, quoted again, that scripture from Malachi, "I, the Lord, do not change, so you, the descendants of Jacob, are not destroyed." It truly is a miracle that from the nations into which God had scattered the Jewish people, they were gathered back to the very land from which they had been deposed and dispersed. We've looked at the prophecy of Jesus about the second exile and the events that led to that. But what happened after that? And this is what I want to give you a brief history of what happened between AD 70 up until the First World War. The Roman Empire ruled the land of Israel between 63 BC to AD 324. In AD 70, Titus, after the horrific siege of Jerusalem, he broke through the walls and slaughtered many of the inhabitants and burnt down the Second Temple. He enslaved those who were not slaughtered. Men and women and children were sold as slaves and then sent to the four corners of the Roman Empire. Many Jewish people were used as slave labour to build the Colosseum in Rome and many other buildings we can still see today in the city of Rome. Many Jewish men were forced to fight in the arenas of Rome and the Colosseum as gladiators. A small number of Jewish people actually remained in the land of Israel. And during the entirety of the Roman occupation from 63 BC to AD 324, up until mid-modern times, there has always been a small Jewish presence in that land, whilst the others were dispersed among the nations of the world. The Roman Empire fell, and after them came the Byzantians. The Byzantium period lasted approximately from AD 324 to AD 638. The Emperor Constantine was a famous emperor during that period. He converted the whole of the Roman Empire to Christianity. And during this Byzantine era, Israel became a predominantly Christian country with churches and monasteries popping up all over the place on traditional Christian sites. Constantine's mother, Queen Helena, visited the Holy Land. She identified, or some would say misidentified, multiple important sites where churches, Christian churches, were later erected in that land. She commissioned the building of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the church which is located in the old city of Jerusalem, and which, according to traditions, dates back to the 4th century. It contains the two holiest sites in Christianity. The site where Jesus was crucified at a place known as Calvary or Golgotha, and Jesus' empty tomb where he is believed by Christians to have been buried and then resurrected. But Constantine and his successor Justinian, and remember, this was just a Roman province which they had named the land or the region of the Philistines. It was just a province to the Romans and then to the Byzantians. Constantine and his successor Justinian tried to force the Jewish people and the empire to convert to Christianity, and there was mixed results. Many Jewish people suffered greatly because the Romans and the Byzantines were very oppressive rulers. The land itself was Roman until AD 324, when the Byzantines took over. And then Byzantine ruled until the year AD 638, and the land had become a Christian land, a Christian place, as had many of the surrounding lands. And then Islam rose up, and early Islam became very aggressive without sufficient provocation from the surrounding Byzantine and Persian empires. They began to spread out and to conquest. And 6 years after the death of the founder of Islam, Muhammad, his heirs Abu Bakr and Umar ibn al-Khattab, they crushed a rebellion against Islam in Arabia. And then they decided to alleviate the internal tensions there by employing the unruly energies within the Ummah, which is the Muslim community, against external foes. So they began to conquer outwards the surrounding regions and places. There was a continued and sustained warfare and invasion of other lands by the aggressiveness of Islam at that time. Their conquest took them west, and they invaded what was the land of Israel, and they occupied it. And these waves of Muslims, they created what was called the Caliphate, or the Muslim Empire. And during this time, the caliphs, the rulers, divided their conquered lands into regions, and Israel was still named the region of the Philistines, based on the Roman names that had been given to it, Palestinia Prima and Palestinia Secunda, the region of the Philistines. So it was never a nation state then. It was just a region of part of a bigger Muslim empire. In AD 638, Omar entered Jerusalem. And then from AD 661 to 750, Jerusalem was ruled under the Umayyad dynasty. And in AD 691, the Dome of the Rock was built on the site of the destroyed Jewish Second Temple, the temple that had been destroyed by the Romans. The Dome of the Rock was built. And then from AD 70 onwards, Jerusalem was ruled under the Abbasid dynasty. The Jewish population had hoped to be treated better by the caliphs during this period than they were by the Romans or the Byzantines, because remember, there was always a Jewish presence in the land, and there was also Christians in the land by this time, and then many Muslims. But the Jewish people and the Christians were not treated well. They were given a choice to fight, to convert, or to pay a very high tax. If they chose to fight, they were told by a bloodthirsty commander of the Muslim armies at that time, Khalid al-Walid. In 642 he said, "You must fight an army that loves death as much as other people love life." And it's interesting that this statement later on inspired the man we know as Osama bin Laden. It still inspires Hamas and Palestinian terrorists today. You often hear that you are fighting people that love death more than you love life. It comes from the year 642 when this Muslim commander said those words. And many terrorists still draw inspiration from those words that were spoken in early Islam. So they had to either fight these people or convert. If they did not convert, then the Muslims massacred many of them. So there was terrible bloodshed that took place in the land under the rule of Islam. Others chose to pay the tax. Jewish people and Christians were relegated to second-class citizens, referred to as dhimmis, which were protected persons. Dhimmis could self-govern, but they faced many restrictions. They could not ride horses or camels. They could not testify in court against a Muslim. There were zoning laws. Their houses had to be built lower than that of their Muslim neighbours, and they faced very high and extortionate taxes because they had to pay this tax for the protection of the privilege of living under Islamic rule. So many Jewish people and Christians suffered greatly during the time they lived in the land under Islamic rule. The city of Jerusalem historically and originally had belonged to the Jewish people. They had owned it 1,000 years before even their Messiah, Jesus, had arrived. Jewish people by divine promise had owned the land for 1,600 years before Islam came and took it. And it's important we remember that historically. From a biblical perspective, it is a myth to assume that either Muslims or Christians ever owned the region by divine right. The promise God had made to Abraham was, and still is, intact. It always was intact, that God had promised this land to the biological descendants of Abraham. In AD 1099, the Crusaders came. They conquered the land and retook Jerusalem. And they controlled the land until around about AD 1260. They did not treat the inhabitants much better than the Muslims. The Crusaders also forced many Jewish people to convert or to die, which is never the way of Christ. Christ calls people to follow him, to choose to follow him. It is not our job as Christians to force people to follow him. And they made a huge mistake, the Crusaders, in doing that. They renamed Jerusalem the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And then they suffered a brief loss of the city to An-Nasir ad-Din Yusuf, or better known to us as Saladin, in 1187. He retook the city of Jerusalem, and then later the Crusaders took it back. Richard the Lionheart retook it in 1191 AD. In AD 1260, a people called the Mamelukes came. This was a nation of mixed origin. It was made up of slaves from the Balkans, from Georgia, from Egypt, Turkey, and other nations, some of which are no longer in existence today. And the Mamelukes had converted to Islam, and they controlled the land of Israel from around AD 1260 up until AD 1517. The Turkish Sultan, Selim, then invaded. In 1517, the Ottoman Empire captured Jerusalem. And from 1538 to 1541, Suleiman the Magnificent, as he is called in history, he rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem, and he made a land part of the Ottoman Empire, and this lasted all the way up until 1917. In 1917, the British captured Jerusalem in World War I. Throughout this long time period of centuries, the whole region we call the Middle East, prior to the First World War, was not a region of countries with borders as we define a country today. It was a people of mixed ethnic, race and religious diversity. Jewish, Christian, Muslim people and others lived in the land, sometimes peaceably together, other times not so. But there was a complex web of tribal affiliations, of diverse interpretations of their own religions, and an ethnically diverse people who lived in that land. And the region of Israel during this period from AD 70 up until the First World War was under the control of a constant stream of invaders and empirical powers. It's important we state again, there was never a nation state called Palestine. It simply did not exist. As I say, this is not an insult to the Palestinian people, it's just an historical fact. There has never been a nation called Palestine. It was just a region under the control of other empirical powers. There was not, is not, never has been a country called Palestine. Only a region with that name ruled by those we have just briefly looked at. The statement Free Palestine, as though it was a country conquered by Jewish people returning home later in 1948, is a disingenuous thing to say, because the country of Palestine never existed, never has existed. That's not to say it won't in the future, but so far, historically, such a nation state has never existed. And the statement Free Palestine is uttered by those who do not know the history of the region, or those who choose to willfully misinterpret the history of that region. Next time we will look at the British Mandate, and we will look at how Zionism was formed and how the British took Jerusalem and the events that led up to the founding of the modern day state of Israel. So I hope this brief history has helped explain to you and to show you how through these long centuries there was always a Jewish presence in the land. There has always been a Christian presence. And since Islam conquered it, those many years, there's always been a Muslim presence. So the three peoples have lived together in that land. But God has said that he does not change, and that the descendants of Jacob will not be destroyed. And God has said that one day he would bring the Jewish people back home into their ancient homeland, the land of Israel. And that is biblical prophecy we saw fulfilled last century, and is still being fulfilled today on a daily basis as the Jewish people return back to their ancient homeland. And it's something we should rejoice in and celebrate the fulfillment of biblical prophecy in our own day and age. God bless you, and join me next time. Amen.